Hello, this is Naomi Mijan, Senior Editor of Building Operating Management Magazine. Thank you for attending today's webcast, Fire Safety Codes, Is Meeting the Minimum Enough? Our presenter is Bill KOFFEL, President of KOFFEL Associates. Bill is recognized as an expert in the fire protection and life safety aspects of codes and standards. Mr. KOFFEL has a Bachelor of Science in Fire Protection Engineering from the University of Maryland and earned his professional engineering license in the specialty of fire protection engineering. He is a past president of the Society of Fire Protection Engineers, serves on numerous NFPA technical committees, and is a past member of the Department of Veterans Affairs Advisory Committee on Structural Safety Issues. He is one of a handful of approved NFPA instructors teaching various code-related seminars nationally and internationally. He has co-authored manuals including the Fire Warning and Safety Systems American Hospital Association Manual, which is the industry's guide to selecting, testing, and maintaining fire suppression, fire alarm, and smoke control systems. Bill also has contributed to, or currently serves on, various panels and committees, including those for Underwriters Laboratory and the International Code Council. Today's learning objectives include: understand the updates to fire safety codes, review compliance requirements and timelines, clarify inspection, testing, and maintenance best practices, and examine other fire protection system compliance issues. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few details about today's event. A live question and answer session will follow today's presentation. To submit questions, please use the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your screen and send your questions to all panelists. Our presenter will answer as many questions as time permits. At the conclusion of today's webcast, you will receive a PDF copy of today's presentation slides. You will also receive a link to a brief online assessment. Upon successful completion of this assessment, you will receive your CEU certificate. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bill.
Thank you, Naomi, and welcome to our program. The one thing I would like to start off with, you probably noticed from the introduction that I am an engineer. I am not an attorney. So when asking this question, sometimes there might be legal implications, and we'll address those a little bit in this presentation, but I do want everybody to understand that I am coming at it from an engineering perspective, from a facility perspective, and not from a liability or legal perspective. So Naomi provided our 4 objectives. One of the things we wanted to talk about was updating the various codes and standards that we need to comply with in our facilities. And the diagram I have actually is from the NFPA, but the process is very similar if I look at the ICC process. Those are the 2 major processes for the organizations that develop building and fire codes that we all must abide by in our respective jurisdictions. Now, let me just use this diagram to explain a few important aspects. All of these documents are available for public input. NFPA calls it public input. ICC calls it proposals. Once an edition is published, as you can see in the top, going from Step 1 to Step 2, the document is open for input from the public for proposed changes. Once that information is received, we go into the first step, which in the NFPA process is a technical committee meeting. It's a working committee meeting. In the ICC process, it is a code development committee hearing. So it's a more formal hearing process. Specific times that are established for people to testify in support or in opposition of the change. But resulting from those first set of meetings or hearings, a report is published identifying what the committee recommendations are for any of these proposed changes. That then gets us into the next phase, which is an opportunity for public comment. Public comment is open to everybody. Again, you don't have to be a member of these organizations. You see the committee report, you have some concerns with what the committee is doing, you have the opportunity to then comment on those committee recommendations. Now, here's where the processes differ a little bit. In the NFPA process, as you can see from the diagram, there's a second draft meeting. That is another technical committee meeting. And these technical committees are comprised of enforcers, insurance, special experts, manufacturers, users like many of yourself. They are all represented on this committee, and the committee has to come to some consensus. In both processes, you are not allowed to introduce new material during this public comment period. So everything is related to what those original proposals were or what the committee did at their first meeting. So as I said, in the NFPA process, we go back to the committee meeting. In the ICC process, it is again a hearing format, but now it is all the voting members of the ICC that get the vote on the committee on the public comments. And the voting members of the ICC, for the most part, are the governmental members, so the building officials and fire officials and plumbing code officials and so forth from the various jurisdictions. From there, we go into, in the NFPA process, we go to one more step, which is at the end of that second draft, if I'm still not happy with the committee recommendation, I can submit what's called a NITMAM, a Notice of Intent to Make a Motion, and that then, if accepted, if it's an appropriate motion that I'm allowed to make, goes to step 3, which is the association's technical meeting. That's where the membership of NFPA, which is a broader membership, but the membership of NFPA gets the vote on my NITMAM, only those items that I submitted a notice of intent to make a motion. And then in both processes, there's an appeal process. That's step 4. But the key of that diagram is this process that we go through. And to put some dates on that process, we're now leading up to the development of the 2024 editions of the International Family of Codes, the ICC documents, and the basic codes that we deal with from NFPA, which is NFPA 1, which is a fire code, NFPA 101, which is the life safety code, or NFPA 5000, which is a building code. The deadline for submitting proposals, or in the case of NFPA, public input to those documents, as you can see on the slide, is early 2021. There are some final steps in the NFPA process for the 2021 edition, but in the International Family of Codes, basically the processes have completed. There's some online governmental voting still occurring, but for the most part, we know what the 2021 editions of those codes are going to say. So from our perspective, if we want to influence change in these codes, those are the critical dates because, again, remember, we cannot submit public new information during the comment period, so it has to be submitted as part of that public input or public proposal process. With NFPA, they have a variety of standards, a sprinkler standard, a fire alarm standard. They all operate under different dates, different cycles. The process is the same as what I outlined, but the dates are slightly different. But as a facility person, clearly one of the important things to recognize is despite what NFPA does, despite what the ICC does, none of these new additions have any legal applicability to your facility unless they're adopted by a fire marshal, a building department, state legislature, however that is done in your area. Somebody has to say, effective some date, we need to comply with the new edition or some edition of the I codes or NFPA. Now, from a design professional standpoint, and I realize most of you are probably facility folks, but from a design professional standpoint, let me give you 2 examples of this concept of standard of care. Because as much as I just said, we don't have to comply with the newest edition. Design professionals can be held to a higher standard by the judicial system, typically referred to as a standard of care. So I mentioned stair geometry. A number of years ago, the codes were determining what the geometry, the riser-tread relationship should be for stairs used in the means of egress. And the consensus seemed to be that we were leaning towards what the current code says, which is the maximum riser height should be 7 inches, the minimum tread dimension should be 11 inches, except in some unique applications or specific applications like inside dwelling units. Well, I was working on a project, was not a dwelling unit. It was a new hotel being built in a jurisdiction that had recently adopted a code that had originally gone to the 711 and then reversed itself, and that's the edition they adopted. And then the edition right after that, they went back to the 711 stair. So my recommendation to the architect as the code consultant on the project was that despite what the code said, we should comply with the 711 riser tread relationship. That is the consensus viewpoint. This jurisdiction operating under an older edition of the code using 711 stairs did not create a non-compliant condition, but it did result in a more restrictive provision. But again, I didn't want to be in a position of defending our use of something other than 711 stairs when everything was going towards the 711 stair. In a similar project, we were required by the applicable code to provide seismic bracing for a sprinkler system using an older edition of NFPA 13. I was well aware that the newer edition of NFPA 13 had introduced more restrictive requirements based upon some of our experience in things like the Northridge earthquake several years ago in California. So again, we approached the project from the perspective that we needed to meet that newer criteria because that was really the current standard of care, what the design professionals should be following, even though we could have used a less restrictive. So neither of these created conflicts, but we could have used a less restrictive set of criteria for that sprinkler system. That just addresses the design professional because we can be held to a higher standard of care. But the answer to the question is meeting the code enough. From a user's perspective, I want to look at it from a slightly different perspective. So NFPA has this document, NFPA 550. It's a guide to fire safety concepts tree, and it has a tree diagram. You can just see the top two levels of the tree, and it says we should establish the fire safety objectives for this project. Now, for many of us, the fire safety objective is going to be to comply with the code. But I just want to pose the question, is that necessarily enough in all instances? Now, the second level of the tree says, for any of our objectives, there's two options. And if I can accomplish either of these 100% of the time, that's all I need to do. Well, in reality, we're not going to be able to do that 100% of the time. So we should be looking at strategies that address preventing fires from occurring, and then also strategies that address the impact of a fire should it occur. But let's go back to these objectives. What are the objectives that you might be interested in as a facility operator, owner, manager? All of us are interested in life safety from fire. And for the most part, the codes really address that. No matter what your applicable code is, life safety in terms of injuries or fatalities to the occupants and the staff is pretty well addressed by the codes. I would argue that the codes don't necessarily address emergency response personnel, like fire department personnel, with the general assumption being that that is an assumed risk, and they can assess the issue and determine whether they should enter that building during a fire event. Very difficult decision for an incident commander to make. Having fire service experience myself, that is challenging, but there may be instances where the decision is made in the interest of the safety of the emergency response personnel. We're going to go in what the fire department calls a surround and drown mode. We're not going to enter the building. But the codes do a pretty good job from a life safety perspective. Property protection. So the codes in their scope statement other than the life safety code, which is purely life safety. But building codes and fire codes will talk about property protection. But I would offer to you that the property protection that they generally talk about is property protection for the public welfare. In other words, we don't want that fire we see in that top photograph spreading from that building to an adjacent building. Now, I would offer that the building codes are also written to prevent that fire from occurring, but, again, there's a certain amount of property protection that's offered by the code. In some other instances, and on the slide I mentioned soot damage. So I was involved in a litigation of a warehouse fire where soot had accumulated on the boxes in the warehouse. It happened to be storing food products. Well, our government, Food and Drug Administration, says if there's soot on the container, even if it's a cardboard box and not the individual container, that food product cannot be sold. So we've lost that product, and I would offer that the codes don't really look at things like soot damage. In the lower right-hand corner, we see a very expensive piece of equipment. There's nothing in the codes that talk about monetary loss. It, again, is primarily public welfare, initially started as spread of fire from one building to another. Today, the codes are pretty well written to prevent fire from one story to another in the building, but not necessarily what might be the, using an insurance term, maximum foreseeable loss. What's the monetary damage that might occur? Now, moving on to some other things that I don't think the codes really do address. Continuity of operation. Depending upon the facility where you are located, it may be very difficult for you to continue your operation should a fire occur, or there may be substantial monetary losses should this fire occur. For example, if I were to pull out a credit card out of my wallet, and I go to use that to purchase something at a store this evening, and the transaction is declined because they are unable to process that charge transaction, what options do I have? Well, if I carry cash, I could potentially use cash. That credit card processing just lost that transaction. I could use a different credit card. That credit card processing company just lost that transaction. I could walk away from the purchase, and maybe I come back some other day and try to reuse that card. But that's suspect if I'm likely to do that. So in other words, if I'm talking about a data center and we're processing credit card transactions, it's very critical that we continue to operate. There's other buildings, like I mentioned on the slide, healthcare. It would be a very difficult situation if we had to suspend operations in a hospital for a fire that was occurring in the hospital. So we want to minimize the impact that fire is going to have on other parts of the facility. Continuity of operations is not really addressed by the codes. Depending upon your location, environmental protection may be a serious consideration. I've done some work in the Netherlands. A lot of coastal waterways, a lot of chemical and fuel facilities along the coast. Clearly, they don't want contamination of that water from a fire event, be it the runoff of the material involved in the fire or the runoff associated with the suppression system that we use. And then lastly, and think about some of the fires that we've seen in the news over the past several months of some historical buildings, things that we're not going to be able to easily replace should a fire occur. So again, preservation of cultural resources if you happen to be in one of those facilities. So to summarize this section in terms of, is compliance with the codes enough? One of the questions that you potentially want to ask or challenge your design team if you're doing a design project is, have we really addressed all of our objectives? I have a concern about continuity of operation, or I have a concern about cultural resources or environmental protection, or if a fire occurs in this part of the building, there's going to be a substantial monetary loss. Maybe we need to go above and beyond the codes to protect those areas of our facility. So let's talk a little bit about compliance requirements and timelines. So I'm using this as an example. CMS is the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They regulate healthcare facilities in the U.S. that are receiving reimbursement from the federal government for providing care to, typically it's the elderly, but there are other people who might qualify for that reimbursement as well. So you can see a timeline that they use to update from what was the 2000 edition of the code to the 2012 edition. Now, this is a process more lengthy than what I would typically see at a local jurisdiction, but you can see that the process started in 2011 with the actual proposed rule being published in April of 2014, with the final rule being published approximately 2 years later and going into effect July 5th, 2016. So again, that's not typical, but clearly in terms of what impact or when will newer editions of a code impact your facility, every jurisdiction is going to have a rulemaking process. There may be one or two hearings. In the case of this process, they don't actually hold a hearing, but they publish their proposed rule, and public has an opportunity to comment, and the agency, CMS, had to respond to those comments and then publish the final rule. That happens at your typical city council meeting. They'll have multiple readings of an ordinance to adopt a new code, and generally there will be some effective date. So, for example, the city of Chicago has finally gone to one of the model codes. They're using the International Building Code. Their implementation time period before that becomes mandatory is approximately 18 months. They opened it up for voluntary use prior to that, but mandatory use is 18 months later, which gives the design team, the consultants who are working on any of your new projects, an opportunity to evaluate whether this project should be in compliance with the current edition or whether we should be looking at the newer edition. It gives you, as an operator of a facility, an opportunity to make any changes that might be necessary because of this new code coming into effect. It would be extremely rare where some situation would occur that would have an immediate impact on your facility that would require upgrades to your facility over a fairly short period of time. But the other timeline to think about is what happens when the fire marshal or somebody comes into this building, your building, and says, you have a non-compliant condition. Again, in most cases, compliance is not necessary immediately. So I've taken some language from the Life Safety Code, NFPA 101, the 2018 edition, and I'm looking at paragraph 4.6.6. And it basically says an existing building may continue to operate provided it has a plan for correction to correct this deficiency. So whenever you get a citing from a fire marshal, they should be giving you a written report, and they are asking you to respond with what you are going to do to correct that situation. In most cases, they allow you to dictate the time to compliance. They may tell you they're coming back in 30 days or 60 days, but generally they allow you to say this is going to take 30 days or 60 days or whatever that time period is to correct. And to be perfectly honest, that's a liability issue as well. If they tell you, okay, it's fine, you can have this exist for 180 days, we'll say the correct fire marshal says we'll say you need to correct this in 180 days. If something happens between the time it was cited until that 180 days, they're somewhat on the hook from a liability standpoint. If you say it's going to take 180 days and they come back and say, okay, that seems reasonable, Yeah, they could be on the hook, but the parameter, the metric that would typically be used by the judicial system is, did they create a situation that you would have been better off if they hadn't even shown up? It's a gross negligence issue argument that has to be made against the public official. So what does the Life Safety Code say about that? The time that you're allowed to comply with a condition is dependent upon three factors. What's the magnitude of the expenditure? If you're in a building that isn't protected with a sprinkler system and the local code says it should be, that could be a costly endeavor. That's not something that's going to happen overnight. So it's appropriate to look at the magnitude of the expenditure to correct that deficiency. What's the disruption of services? Again, to say that you were going to sprinkler the building, that might be a huge disruption to your service, to your operation. So we can again look at that. One of the things that the healthcare industry has done is to phase in sprinkler protection in existing buildings during other rehabilitation projects, as compared to having a hard line that says all hospitals have to be sprinklered effective such and such a date. And then what's the degree of hazard? So let me use few quick examples. And again, I have a fire marshal background as well. You saw that in the introduction. If I come into your building and I see an exit sign not illuminated, what's the magnitude of expenditure? Not a big cost item. What's the disruption of services? Not much to correct that in most situations. What's the degree of hazard? Depends upon the occupancy, but a single exit sign not properly illuminated, I don't look at that as a life-threatening situation. Certainly would be reasonable if you were to come back and say, that'll take 30 days for me to correct. I would probably look at that and say that's reasonable. We'll check it 30 days or some period after 30 days. I've already used the sprinkler example. Let me use one other example. I walk into your facility and you're operating an assembly occupancy, let's say a nightclub, and I see that all the exits other than the main entrance exit to the building are locked. People cannot get out. What's the magnitude of the expenditure? Probably not a whole lot to correct that unless you want to get into alternative locking arrangements. What's the disruption of service? Probably not a big deal to get the locks off of the building. What's the degree of hazard? Significant. We have a number of fire incidents where people have not been able to get out because all of the egress facilities, required egress facilities, were available to them. In that instance, as a fire marshal, I might tell you that has to be corrected right now or we're shutting this building down because of the degree of hazard. That's what that life safety code language gives to us. Now, sometimes the codes will use language like you have to correct something promptly or you have to correct something immediately. Be very careful if that is the language. I've had some situations, some litigation cases where that language has come into play and somebody took a couple days to correct something and let's say a sprinkler pipe failed between the time that the leak was detected until it was to have been corrected, resulting in additional water damage. And the word promptly was used prevalently quite often in that case as to what the contractor should have done, what the building owner, management company should have done. But the other question you should be asking yourself is, during this period of noncompliance, are there things that we can do that will reduce the risk associated with the fact that we're not in full compliance with the code? So I'm going to use a concept that's in the healthcare community, and this deals with one of the accrediting organizations. They have this concept of interim life safety measures. The acronym is ILSM. And basically they say that if a situation cannot be corrected while one of their surveyors is on site, the facility needs to evaluate the need for an interim life safety measure. Now, the slide refers to 8 hours. That's more or less a recommendation. They actually say the facility needs to have a policy as to how long this situation can occur before they evaluate the need for interim life safety measures, and then they need to document that they went through this process. So here's the documentation. You're asked the question, what's the likelihood of harm? That gets to that degree of hazard question. And then we go through a series of things to say, well, based upon this situation, should I have a fire watch because my sprinkler system's not operational? Should we post additional signage because I have a construction activity going on and my primary or initial means of egress are not readily available? Should we be inspecting exits on a daily basis? Should I put in some alternate protection? I had a hospital one time with a fire alarm system problem, and the time it's going to take to correct that, we suggested that they go with a wireless system as a short-term solution, low cost, lower cost, short-term solution to correct that while they're installing or replacing the fire alarm system. So I'm not going to go through every one of those, but basically it forces me to evaluate, are there some things that I should do, again, with the intent that I'm going to reduce this degree of hazard that's associated with the risk or the non-compliant condition. Okay, so moving on, so we've kind of covered the first two objectives, inspection, testing, and maintenance best practices. So I currently chair the NFPA 25 committee. That's the committee responsible for NFPA 25, which is inspection, testing, and maintenance of water-based fire protection systems. As you saw in the introduction, I've done some other publications related to inspection, testing, and maintenance. So let's first talk about what is inspection, testing, and maintenance. So inspection is the visual observation that what you have appears to be in proper operating condition. And when it comes to NFPA 25, that's very critical because there is language in the administrative chapter of NFPA 25 that says the inspector is not required to verify the adequacy of the design of the system. In other words, don't expect a contractor that you hire to do inspection services under NFPA 25 to tell you if that sprinkler system's adequate for the hazard being protected, that you have sprinklers everywhere you are supposed to have them. They are not required to do that. They are simply required to verify that what you have appears to be in proper operating condition. Testing, I am now manipulating the system. So as an engineering firm, we don't provide inspection, testing, and maintenance services. We will evaluate programs, but we don't provide the actual service. However, if we're hired to survey a building and we see something wrong with the fire alarm system or the sprinkler system or some other fire protection feature or system, I would expect that my folks will notify the people, the owner, even if it is not within the scope of our contract. Now, I will tell you there's attorneys that will tell me otherwise, but as an engineer, I believe it's within our canon of ethics to tell you things that we observe, whether they're in our scope or not. We do not do testing. We're not really set up to do testing. Testing often requires special equipment. If I were to do a test of your sprinkler system and a coupling failed, I would have no choice but to turn that system off and leave you with an impaired sprinkler system. A contractor potentially can repair your system and get it back in proper operating condition. I would have to tell you to call a contractor to do that repair. But I'm actually testing. I'm flowing water through a fire pump or something along that line. And then maintenance is to restore the system to its original condition. Repair work, what we see here, cleaning of a smoke detector, that's putting it back into its normal operating condition. Now, we put all that together and we have inspection, test, and maintenance. The NFPA standards vary as to who can provide that service. In some cases, they require a certain level of certification to service portable fire extinguishers or kitchen hood systems. What you see here is a definition out of NFPA 25, which simply says the person has to be competent and approved by the authority having jurisdiction or acceptable to the authority having jurisdiction. So if I wanted to, I could sell a service to you to inspect, test, and maintain your sprinkler system because I believe I'm competent and capable of doing that, and unless the authority having jurisdiction says otherwise, I could sell that service. In terms of best practices, there are certification programs out there that you could require the people who are providing this service to be certified. In some states, I might have to be licensed. The company might have to be licensed. The individual might have to have a license. California and Florida are examples of states that have some very unique requirements in this area. But first off, check with the local authority having jurisdiction or the state agency to find out who's qualified to do it, and then determine whether that's adequate for your needs, or do I want to make sure that these folks have some additional qualifications through a certification process. Remember that essentially every one of these standards, this comes out of NFPA 25, but essentially all of the NFPA standards put the responsibility for inspection, testing, and maintenance squarely on the owner. You have the ability to designate that task to somebody under a contract, but ultimately you are responsible for inspection, testing, and maintenance of the system. The owner is responsible to give accessibility to the organization. One of the things I tell my folks, if we're surveying a building and our scope says to survey the entire building, if there's a portion of that building that you say we can't enter for whatever reason, that needs to be in our report. Same thing should happen with inspection, test, and maintenance. We don't really have time to go into it, but I can tell you that there are fire incidents that have occurred, and sprinkler contractors have said, oh, well, we weren't given access to that area, and that happens to be where the fire occurred. But they didn't note it in their report, so it's unknown whether they really had access or not. There's certain notifications before you do inspection, test, and maintenance. The last thing you want to have happen is for the fire department to respond because you're testing the fire alarm system or the sprinkler system. But at the same time, we don't want to create a false sense of security. I've been in buildings where they're testing the fire alarm system, and they don't put out any pre-notification. And the people are just ignoring the system because it keeps going off. And while they're testing it at that time, if something happens tomorrow, they're going to just say, oh, well, that's part of the test. They didn't tell us yesterday they were testing the system, so I'm not going to respond unless somebody tells me we need to respond. So advance notice to everybody that we are going to test the system. It's not uncommon for me to check into a hotel, get a notice as I check in to say tomorrow from 10 o'clock to 3 o'clock, we're going to be testing the fire alarm system. Now I know there's a test going on. The owner is responsible for corrections and repairs. And again, I've seen some litigation cases where this has been disputed between the owner and the contractor, the owner thinking, well, you're going to correct anything you see wrong. Well, most owners aren't just going to give a contractor a blank check to correct everything. A lot of times we have to go through a proposal process. It has to be approved, and then the owner authorizes by approval of that proposal the repair to be done. This is the one that I really have concern with, and that is that if you make any change in your building that might affect the sprinkler system, it is your responsibility to identify that change and to make any corrective actions necessary. Now, the reason I have a problem with this is a lot of building owners don't really understand the factors that go into successful sprinkler operation. So several years ago, I was doing an NFPA 13 seminar. That's the standard for design and installation of sprinkler systems. And we were going through what's called commodity classifications, how I classify that product you're storing in a warehouse. And at the end of the discussion, a person raised her hand and she said, so you're telling me that the fact that she's from the cosmetic industry, the fact that we are putting our product in plastic containers today as compared to glass containers, that should require a reevaluation of the sprinkler system? And my answer was absolutely. Let's look at the language right here in the standard. And it will talk about a non-combustible product in a plastic container, a non-combustible product in a glass container. And it's completely different design criteria. Again, most owners don't understand those little nuances. Think about the packaging material that you get in products you buy and get delivered to your home. We've had a wide range of packaging material that can affect whether the sprinkler system is adequate or not. I change the use of a space. I have a room that's an office, and I decide to use it for storage. The sprinkler system may not be adequate for storage in that space. And again, the inspector of your system is not required to let you know there is a problem. Now, in my mind, a good inspector will ask you the question, have you made any changes since I was last here? And based upon your answer to that question, they will say, well, you really should have an analysis done of the sprinkler system for that area based upon the changes that you made. But it's solely dependent upon you providing that information. Record keeping is a big issue with inspection, test, and maintenance of systems. As one who does some expert witness work, if there's a problem with a system, one of the first things I will ask for are all the inspection, test, and maintenance records. And notice I bolded the one bullet. And it says, you're supposed to have the original acceptance test record. So I had a water leak in a hospital, and I was representing the sprinkler contractor. A coupling failed, and they could not produce for me the fact that they had done the hydrostatic test when the system was installed, which doesn't necessarily get them off the hook, but it certainly helps in my defense to say, well, the system withstood 200 PSI during the acceptance test. As it stood, we couldn't verify that they had ever done an acceptance test of the system. So they're now more at risk for not having that documentation. And you as an owner are required to do it. For a fire alarm system, you should have something that looks like this. Today, fire alarm systems are programmed. And basically, this tells me that if a smoke detector on the second floor goes into alarm, then we are going to notify the occupants on the first, second, and third floor. I don't know how I test your system if I don't have this, because I don't know what that smoke detector is supposed to do. This is something the design professional would have put together, the installing contractor would have updated it, and this is what the contractor will use to program your fire alarm system. So hopefully you have this sequence of operations matrix, or there's a couple other terms for it, but you have this documentation. NFPA 72 does a better job than some other standards. It specifically says that a record of completion, this document that tells me all kinds of things about your system, should be stored at your fire alarm control unit in a cabinet that's marked fire alarm documents. So I would have that sequence of operations matrix available to me if I were testing your system. And here's just some examples of what those might look like. As noted on the slide, I didn't mention it, you can store these documents at some other location other than the control unit, but when you do that, the location of where these documents are located should be identified on the control unit. So one of the things, and this kind of goes back to timelines, that NFPA 25 has done recently, started with the 2011 edition, which is why I put that date there, is they've identified critical and non-critical deficiencies. And the original concept was that the committee would come in and say, well, if you have a critical deficiency, it has to be corrected in 30 days. A non-critical deficiency has to be corrected in some other time frame. The 25 committee said that's not our issue. We think it's appropriate to identify critical and non-critical deficiencies, but it is really up to you as an owner and the authority having jurisdiction, going back to our 101 language, to determine what that timeline for compliance is. I could walk in and say, well, this is a critical deficiency, but you also have some other things that are critical deficiencies, and they're more critical than this one. I would hope that you would be dealing with the higher risk items first. Again, I can't easily write a standard to address all that, but you can work that out with the authority having jurisdiction. Lastly, I'd like to talk about some compliance issues that I have seen with systems. So, some common mistakes. People who are working in your building don't really know your building. They don't understand how you're going to use the building. They don't understand your emergency plan. I have a huge remediation project going on and a large project overseas because the fire alarm system and the sprinkler system was not zoned to the smoke compartments that they have in that hospital. And they want to do everything on a smoke compartment by smoke compartment basis in terms of relocating patients and so forth. It doesn't work if my systems don't coincide with those passive fire protection features. Integration of systems. Years ago, we had these standalone, fairly simple fire protection systems. Today, we've got smoke control systems in buildings that are integrated with our fire alarm system because it's the detectors that are going to actuate the smoke control system. It needs to be integrated with other HVAC systems in the building that might impact the performance of my smoke control system. If I don't properly integrate those systems, the desired outcome may not be or the actual outcome may not be what we had desired. The second bullet, major bullet on the slide, smoke detection for air handler shutdown. So, sometimes in the design team, we'll get fingers pointed at each other. Well, the fire protection engineer should have done that. Or they'll say, no, the mechanical engineer should have done it. Point is, the code says it has to be done. It doesn't necessarily say who in the design team does it. So, again, you want to make sure that happens. I can give you some real fire scenarios, one of which resulted in 25 fatalities in a hospital in Saudi Arabia. Part of the reason for the fatalities was that the air handling system did not shut down because the smoke detectors were never connected with the building management system. So this is related, integration of the fire alarm system with other building systems. But in this one, I focus a little bit more on security as well. So from a life safety perspective, are our building fire alarm systems integrated with our security systems so that I have the appropriate egress facilities when we need it? Yes, I also do talk about smoke control in this slide as well. Proper selection. So one of the things I often tell our clients if we're designing a fire protection system is I would like the people who are going to do the inspection, test, and maintenance involved in the review of our design. Because we are going to make decisions on equipment, location of equipment, that's going to affect their ability to inspect, test, and maintain that equipment. Let's have their input as part of the design team. Look at this atrium. So historically, people would locate spot-type smoke detectors up on the top of the atrium. NFPA 72 says on an annual basis, I need to access that detector. I need to do a functional test of that smoke detector. How are you going to do it if it's out in the middle of this atrium? Are we going to bring lift equipment in here for people to get to that smoke detector? Or the fact that we didn't provide access, are they simply going to say, well, we're not going to test that detector at this time. It's not convenient. But I could have put projected beam detectors on those walls along the balcony that you see there. Now I can access the projected beam detector from the floor of the balcony. and I can do the required testing. Okay. Today, there's increased emphasis on intelligibility of the fire alarm system. For many of you, if you have a voice communication system, you might have an announcement that sounds something like, you can't understand it. Now, I know it's a fire because I see lights flashing and I heard that alert tone, so I respond to it as a fire signal. But today in many buildings, because we might not want everybody to evacuate, we need intelligibility. One of the key aspects to intelligibility is actually more devices capped at a lower power setting to have a more equal sound distribution, and that will significantly increase intelligibility. NFPA 72 says it's up to the design team to determine what's referred to as acoustically distinguishable spaces, those spaces where intelligibility is an issue. And another related to equipment is not selecting the proper equipment for the environment. So this is actually a janitor's closet in a hospital. You can see at the top a concealed sprinkler just to the right of the light fixture. I can see a smoke detector, and I can see a hot water dispenser. And what happens in this scenario is housekeeping will often go in. Notice there's a self-closing device on the door. The door closes behind them. They put a bucket underneath this hot water dispenser. Look how close it is to the smoke detector. The next thing we know, we fill this room with steam, we get a smoke detector on. This particular facility, not solely from this scenario, they were experiencing on the magnitude of 30 nuisance alarms a month. A lot of it had to do with improper selection of equipment or improper programming of the equipment that caused alarm conditions when it didn't really need to. So, again, you as the owner, you know your building better than any of us, might want to weigh in on whether this equipment is proper for that application. And lastly, when you put all this money into a system or a new building, let's make sure it's functioning properly. Again, this is coming from a former fire marshal. We know that a lot of owners are going to say, oh, well, we don't have to hire the engineer to do that. The fire marshal's going to come out. Fire marshal's going to do certain things. Depending upon where you are, it might be rather rigorous. It might be less rigorous. But they are focusing on the code compliance issues. And if I go back to our objective, you might have protection features that exceed the code to address some of these other objectives that you have. They may or may not be testing all of those systems, all of those features. So I would highly recommend that you make sure things are done properly. If I get out of systems and talk about through penetration fire stop systems, I've been involved in numerous litigation cases where allegations were made that it was not done properly. That could have been picked up during construction much easier than post-occupancy. On the far right of the slide is a counterfeit sprinkler. To many of us, it looks like a legitimate sprinkler. It's even got a Tyco marking on it. So Tyco's a manufacturer. We would think everything's okay. Close examination of that sprinkler, it was a counterfeit sprinkler. I actually have an associate that found 500 counterfeit sprinklers in a brand new building that had been missed during the normal regulatory process. He's actually with an insurance company. They had gone in after the company already had the occupancy permit for the building and said, these sprinklers are counterfeit sprinklers. So, again, I think it's worth spending a little money, a little time, to make sure that the features you have in your building are going to function the way you intended them to, or the design team intended them to, during a fire incident. Okay, so I know we've covered a lot of things. We do have some time for questions. So are there any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. As Bill said, we do have a couple minutes for questions, so feel free to use that panel on the right-hand side of your screen to type in your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. Bill, to begin with, I wanted to pick up on that notification requirement. One question that I have is we're seeing more and more kind of distributed notification, desktop notification, and notification being pushed out to handheld personal devices. Are those kinds of emergency communication systems developments removing any of the pressure from that intelligibility requirement, or do you still need to have a very good intelligibility, that's a tough word, in addition to any other notifications?
So I can certainly look at text notification as an alternative to intelligibility. NFPA 72 does not require intelligibility for most fire alarm systems. It does have an intelligibility requirement for mass notification systems because depending upon the event, I might want completely different responses. Fire, I want you to evacuate. Active shooter incident, I want you to barricade. So it's important that the recipient, the occupants, can understand the message that's being delivered. And yes, textual notification would be a way to address it. We do have to remember, however, that in the U.S. we have some accessibility requirements. So I often have to consider the fact that I may have individuals in this building that have at least one type of impairment. So textual notification might not be adequate for the site impaired, which means I would have to supplement it with something else to address that impairment.
And then along with the intelligibility, especially for sites that might have a multinational population or visitors, is there also a requirement for multi-language, or is it just the home language, I guess, is the requirement?
So the 2019 edition of NFPA 72 added a requirement that said, at a minimum, a voice communication system needs to be in the official language of that jurisdiction, and they allow the authority having jurisdiction to determine what that language is. Now, that one hospital photo that I gave you of the janitor's closet, that's actually in the United Arab Emirates. When they opened that hospital, they opened with a staff from 50 different countries. So we clearly had some language issues to deal with. So the standard says, in that case, Abu Dhabi Civil Defense would tell us what the primary language was going to be. In that facility, it happened to be English, that everything had to be in English. If we wanted to supplement it with Arabic, we could do that, but we at least had to communicate in the English language. The problem you have is that sometimes these messages get a little lengthy, and to try to start sending it out in multiple different languages would be very challenging. We don't have the option that we have when we go to a website that says, do you want the English version or the Spanish version or the French version or the German version of the website? You know, it's going to be what it is. So remember, it is being supplemented by some other audible and visual cues, however. So the fact that we've got the strobe lights flashing, we have the alert tone, and we can, at least in the hospital, we could train staff to say, when this happens, this is what your response should be. But it is an issue with our global nature of society today.
Mm-hmm. You had a slide that towards the end about the interface between security and the fire safety system. And I just wanted to ask a question, like also with the development of technology, we're having more and more systems, security systems that have more granular data as to like where people are in a building at any given time. Is there anything from the codes that you're seeing that they're starting to pick up on that functionality where you're going to be required to have that level of location data imported from the security system into the fire safety system?
Not from a mandatory requirement. Remember, the codes are a minimum set of requirements, and most people would say that that's not something that I would be required to have to meet a minimum standard. Do I see that type of thing happening? Yes. Understand that there are some resistance. There is going to be some resistance to that. The employees might be concerned about Big Brother watching where they are and how much time they spend at different places. We have a requirement in some high-rise buildings where we require video cameras in the stairs, which we put in there to address the ability of the incident commander to assess conditions in the stair, and maybe we should be telling people to use a different stair. However, we have some building owners, such as General Services Administration, that says we can't do that in certain buildings. You know, if I've got a informant coming in to talk to, let's say, the FBI, we don't want any documentation that shows that person's in the building. So we actually had to write the language to say that, yes, we have this need for a camera for purposes of assessing conditions, but it can be arranged so that there is no facial recognition. So you're balancing privacy considerations versus public safety considerations. But yes, I do see more and more of that. You know, we've often talked even in our own office. We have an access control system. Wouldn't it be nice to tie it into our server so that if I did not swipe that I'm in the office, even if somebody had the password to my computer, they could not get on my computer? That's an appropriate operational consideration and certainly something to be considered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to also clarify a question that I had earlier in the presentation. It dealt with when you were talking about space use changes and how you might have an office that becomes a storage facility and then your system is no longer adequate for that use. I just want to make sure I understood that in that scenario, the inspector doesn't have to tell you this might be a problem. Did I misunderstand that?
No, that's correct. NFPA 25 says that the inspector that you hire, or might even be an internal person, who you have doing that inspection of that sprinkler system, they are not required to evaluate the design or the installation of the system. Now, again, I think it's a good practice for an inspector to say, we observed that a room previously used as an office is now being used for storage. You should have your system evaluated. Having said that, there's an attorney that we work with who does a lot of defense work for sprinkler contractors, and his perspective is absolutely not. Don't do that. The moment you do that, you're establishing a standard of care, and the owner has an expectation that you have evaluated other design issues with the system. So again, it's a balance between what's good fire protection versus liability considerations. Again, we're going to do it as an engineering firm. We have a canon of ethics that would tell us we need to do it. If we see it, we'll let you know. But a sprinkler contractor would not be required to let you know. And I will say this issue has gone all the way to the Supreme Court in the state of New Jersey on a fire incident where two fire incidents where a sprinkler was not in the room where the fire started, and the sprinkler should have been in those rooms. It was interesting that the Supreme Court in New Jersey, at least, did say, we don't care what NFPA 25 says. Sprinkler contractor, you're the fire protection expert. You should have told the owner that a sprinkler should have been in that space. But that's a judicial system. That's not what's required by the standard.
Right. Wow. That's really fascinating. And it's just a little bit scary. Well, Bill, thank you so much. This has been a really great presentation full of so much useful information. So we really appreciate it. So I think with that, we're going to wrap up the webcast.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating.